The Ecology Part 2 notes are on population ecology. Populations are when groups of organisms that belong to the same species live in the same localized area. It's important that you understand both parts of those definitions. Same species, same area, that's key to the definition of a population. Members of the same biological species are defined by these boundaries if they are members of the same populations, because remember, you could have two different populations that belong to the same species that do not come in contact with each other. They are reproductively isolated from each other because they are in separate populations. They share different gene pools. Members of the same population rely on the same set of resources since they do live together in the same area. They would also be influenced similarly by any environmental factor, and they have a high chance of interacting with each other since they do all live together. Populations are shaped by the interactions that they have between individuals within their population and within their environment. And this is something that can be studied from an ecological standpoint as well as an evolutionary standpoint. All of these things are going to shape populations over time. Natural selection, we've already said, can modify characteristics within a population based on whether or not the trait has an advantage. If it does, nature will select for that trait, and that trait has a higher chance of being passed on to the next generation because it leads to an increased chance of survival and therefore an increased chance of reproduction for that particular member. Populations will involve intra-specific relationships. It's important that you know what an intra-specific relationship means. Intra means within, and specific means species, so within the same species. But really we're talking about relationship between members of the same species that live in the same area. Usually we're talking about populations here. So intra-specific relationships are relationships within a population. Members of the same population will have relationships with each other. There are two types, competition and cooperation. In the case of competition, members of the population will compete with each other for the same set of resources. This will lead to some organisms being more successful than others. Those that have the adaptation tend to be more successful and outcompete the others, leading to a negative effect overall for members who don't have that adaptation. And this, of course, will lead to natural selection. You can probably think of lots of examples of competition within populations, but I have listed a few here. Birds, for example, some of them will migrate to warmer temperatures during the cold temperature months, and this a lot of times has to do with they need to search for food. But once they migrate with their population, if they run out of food, it will cause some to continue to migrate further due to competition. We see this a lot with plants as well. Plants may grow very densely together in their populations, and this can lead to overcrowding. If the leaves pile on top of each other, then some leaves will not have access to light and therefore leads to decline of photosynthesis. They may also have other types of things they're competing for as well, like water or nutrients in the soil. Farmers tend to reduce this competition by planting their crops uniform distances from each other in all directions, and this is so that they don't have to compete for these sets of resources. So when you see fields of crops when you drive by them, you'll notice how perfectly ordered they are. That's why. This maximizes their crop yield, which maximizes their profit. Cooperation is different because this time members are working together in order to benefit typically all members that are involved in this cooperative behavior. This is more common in animals that have social behaviors with each other rather than antisocial animals or in plants. Some examples are shown here. Birds often will roost together on the same branch, huddled all nice and tightly together to conserve warmth. That way allows for them to stay warm during the night, for example, when they're sleeping. And they'll often take turns with who's on the outside, since whoever's on the outside gets less body heat. We see this in penguins as well, especially during a storm. They'll huddle together in order to stay warm, and they tend to rotate those that are on the outside to the middle of the huddle. And I'll show you a video of that in just a second. Here we have a bait ball. A bait ball is when a group of fish that are prey swim together very quickly, and they become very tightly packed together. And this makes it really hard for predators to get in there and catch them. Here's the video. In order to best study populations, we need to know what characteristics to study. One is going to be their boundaries. Boundaries are what defines the area that makes up that population. These can be natural boundaries, rivers, mountain ranges perhaps, but they can also be man-made boundaries like roadways. Population size is also important. We can sometimes count organisms directly, but this does not happen very often. We can typically only do this when an organism is large and the area is small, and when we don't have any other interferences in their way. For example, there's nothing that causes the organisms to be hidden, or the organisms don't camouflage, they don't burrow, things like that. So an example of an organism that may be able to be counted directly would be an elephant. We can fly drones over and count the elephants directly. We can also use sampling techniques. This is more common. Sampling techniques allow you to take a sample of a population and then use math to estimate how many organisms they think are present within that population during that time period. You do have to make sure that the sample is unbiased. So this means you're making sure that you're not choosing the data on purpose. And there are different ways to do this. Linked index is one method of a sampling technique. This is where you would capture organisms, particularly mobile organisms that move around a lot, capture them, put a mark on them, release them back out, and then do a recapture where you then count the number of organisms within your recapture that have a mark versus those that do not. And then you'd use a math formula to estimate the population size. In order to make sure the sample is unbiased, you might use like a coordinate grid where you've set up that area with different coordinates, and then you use a random number generator to put your traps out to choose the random coordinates for you. Random number generators can be on calculators, on computers, or there's random number tables. So there's different ways to make sure that your sample is unbiased. A biased sample means you walk straight over to a group of organisms and you choose those. We don't want to do that. Quadrat sampling is used for sessile or non-mobile organisms. This is going to involve a big quadrat that will have a grid on it, and then you take the quadrat to your location and then you put it down in an unbiased area, and you would take multiple samples. So you'd probably use a random number generator and some sort of grid that you've decided within that particular area as well. And then you would count the organisms present within each sample, and then again use math to figure out how many organisms are likely present. So this might be good for plants, for example, or barnacles. Oops, I skipped a slide. Other things that are important for populations are going to be their density. Density is different than population estimates because this also takes into account the space that they live in, but it does use the population estimates to figure this out. So you would need to know the boundaries so that you could calculate the area as well as the population estimate. And it's how many organisms are present per area, per amount of space, essentially. More densely populated populations will have more organisms living in a particular area, And if you looked at that same area, but there was less organisms that lived there, then that would be less densely populated. And then we have dispersion, and this is like any type of pattern of spacing that they may make within their population. It can be clumped, where you see like little groups of organisms, like schools of fish. It can be uniform, where they tend to be more evenly spaced. We see this a lot with plants. And then it could be random, where there's actually no pattern. We see this with other types of plants, like tropical forest plants. Let's look at some pictures. Here's our randomly distributed forest plants. Here's some caterpillars all clumped on this leaf. There'd be another clump on a different leaf, and so on. And then here's some uniform plants. So we see this a lot with desert plants because they have so much competition for water. And this is like what inspired farmers to plant their crops in a more organized way. Here's some clumped schools of fish. Here's some more random plants. And then here are some penguins. When penguins are not in a swarm and huddled all together, then they do tend to be uniformly distributed, where each penguin family has its own like little space. There are several things that will affect the ability of a population to be in growth or decline during a period of time. Things that cause populations to increase in size would be births. This is also known as natality. So how many organisms are being born would add to the population size, as well as immigration with an I, which is when organisms move into that population from another population. Things that can take away from population growth are going to be deaths. That's known as mortality. And then emigration with an E, organisms are leaving the population. Generation time also affects the ability of a population to grow. Not all organisms have the same length of time between each generation. Usually smaller organisms have a smaller generation time. Larger organisms tend to have a longer generation time, and this would affect their ability to grow at a faster or slower rate. And then sex ratio, the proportion of males to females within that population. That's going to matter because sometimes you need lots of females for the males if males are going to mate with several females, but in other populations you may have a 1-to-1 ratio that's more important because they tend to pair up and stay like lifetime partners, for example. And so that ratio would matter based on the species. There's a little bit of math that you could do to estimate population growth if you knew how many were being born versus how many were dying. So if you knew the birth rate and the death rate, you could subtract the death rate from the birth rate, and that would give you the growth rate. So the variable B would be death rate, birth rate, D would be death rate, and R is the overall rate of growth. When R is positive, the population is increasing in size. When R is negative, the population is decreasing in size. Zero population growth would occur when there is no difference between the birth rate and the death rate. So R would equal 0. One way that we use population estimates is for commercial fishing populations. And this is really challenging to do since fish are highly mobile and they tend to school. But it's really important that we do this because commercial fishing is a huge industry and it impacts a lot of jobs and food on tables for people. And so they do need to try and estimate these population sizes. When a population of commercial fish is in serious decline, stricter laws would be in place. We may have a season where we can't fish for them at all, right? We have to help get their numbers back up. But this is why there are strict laws in place for commercial fishing. There may be a season that opens where you can only fish during that time of year. There may be a catch max, right? So you may only be able to catch 3 fish a day or 10 fish a day, something like that, if you have a license. There may be a size issue. So perhaps you can only keep the fish that are over a certain size and you have to throw the smaller ones back. But these laws are really important to help kind of stabilize these populations so this industry can stay open. So like I said, it provides a lot of jobs for people and it provides a lot of food for people. So it's a really important industry. When people fish illegally, it tends to cause this sort of rapid decline right here. So it is important that we follow the rules. There are two different population growth models that we'll study. Exponential growth, which tends to be more like a J-shaped, and then, sigmoidal growth, which will tend to level off and take on more of an S shape. Sigmoidal growth is often called logistical growth as well. Exponential growth occurs when resources are completely unlimited. So they have the ideal unlimited environment, and therefore they can just grow, 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 grow. We tend to see this in small organisms, microorganisms like bacteria. Typically, environments don't have unlimited resources, and once they run out of those resources, they will reach what's called carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the maximum population size that that environment can support if there's no other factors that are changing within that particular environment. That variable is represented by K. K is the carrying capacity, and it is a set property of the environment, which means it doesn't change unless the environment changes. So if the max number of individuals is 1,000, that's it. 1,000 individuals can be successfully supported. Anything over that would lead to decline because they would not have enough resources to survive. So if other resources do change, though, for example, more water, more food comes in, then potentially carrying capacity could change. Carrying capacity is what causes logistical growth to have this phase where it does level off. At some point, or during the beginning, you will go through exponential growth where there's a lot of births, nothing really limiting them, but then you'll reach like a slowdown phase, and then hopefully an equilibrium will occur. As the population density increases during this phase, they tend to start being impacted much more so by density-dependent factors. Density-dependent factors lead to negative feedback. Negative feedback is when the population comes up past carrying capacity and then comes back down, right? And this will allow for the ecosystem to be more stable in regards to population size. So we need this negative feedback. Organisms start dying because they're taking on, there's too many organisms that environment can support. So we need this like feedback mechanism to allow for the population to become stable over time. Density-dependent factors do affect more densely populated populations more intensely because there's so many more individuals within that particular space that if they run out of a resource, which is a density-dependent factor, then it would very much so impact that population negatively. It would impact less densely populations more or less densely. So when we look at this picture, you can see there's plenty of space here for all the organisms. They've not yet reached carrying capacity, and here we're over. So at some point, these birds don't have a place to hide, so it's going to lead to their decline. Here are examples of density-dependent factors. Predation, because predators will come in, and if it's more densely populated, they will have more prey to come in and eat. Diseases and parasites, they move through densely populated populations more quickly because organisms are huddled close together, and therefore these diseases can spread at a much faster rate. And then competition for any resource is density dependent. Nutrients for plants, nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil, for example, light, food, space, things like that. Accumulation of waste. We see this a lot in microorganisms. A good example of this is in yeast. You can see that yeast goes through exponential growth, but if they're doing this in like a flask, for example, remember they're going to be undergoing fermentation, which releases alcohol, and they can only tolerate alcohol, which is their waste product, to a certain level. And once that alcohol level gets to a certain point, it will kill the yeast. And so we will eventually see like this rapid decline as a bunch of yeast start to die. And then stress. So a lot of these factors that are up here will lead to stress, and stress is going to cause internal imbalances within that particular organism. It could cause changes in their hormones, which could lead to them not being able to reproduce as much or at all. It could cause them to become more aggressive. It could cause them to not reach sexual maturity in a timely manner, and so that would slow down population growth. Here's just another picture showing that logistical growth curve. In this period of time, the birth rate is much higher than the death rate, so we're growing, and then at some point they start to sort of flip-flop that, and more organisms will start to die, and eventually we will lead to a stable community or ecosystem. And then here shows the same thing. So here's exponential, right? Rapid growth right here. As n, which is the population size, approaches k, we'll reach a slowdown phase right here, and then eventually it will level off. And this produces the sigmoidal shaped curve. So during the beginning phase, we call that the lag phase. The growth of the population is very slow. Then we get this period of rapid growth where n is much less than k, because we've not reached k yet, but they are growing at a rapid rate. That's the exponential phase. As we get closer to k, the growth rate will slow down. We call this the transitional phase. And then we'll reach the plateau phase, where k has been reached at the maximum sustainable population. Lag phase, slow growth. Exponential phase, rapid growth. Transitional phase, slow down of growth. Plateau phase, level off, equilibrium. And then just more curves showing that. Notice that it's not quite perfect, right? We can overshoot carrying capacity, and then we're going to get that negative feedback back down, right? Then we're going to be way under carrying capacity, so we're going to go back up, and it can just kind of teeter-totter back and forth around the carrying capacity. That's normal. Density-independent factors do not change when the population is more dense or less dense. So these types of factors are going to influence all populations the same or similarly, typically negatively. These are usually like natural disasters, so freezes or extremely cold temperatures, a lot of heat, fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, any major storm. These things just tend to come in and wipe out the entire population, or a lot of the population, and so that's why they don't affect populations different based on their density. They're pretty random. Most ecologists are going to agree that it's a variety of both density-dependent factors and density-independent factors that will put limits on population sizes. Limiting factors are the things that put pressures on population growth, selection pressures, so pressures that are going to kind of pressure the organism itself within that population to survive, and some of them won't. So populations can be limited by limiting factors that limit them from the bottom up throughout the food chain. These are called bottom-up limiting factors. So these are going to affect like lower level organisms first, like plants, for example. If plants don't have enough nutrients to support their population, now there's not enough to support the herbivores. Now there's not enough herbivores to support the carnivores, and so on up through the food chain. So, but it starts at the bottom. Bottom-up limiting factors limit organisms on the lower trophic levels first, and that has a negative impact on all levels above them. Versus top-down limiting factors are the ones that limit populations from the top down. This usually involves predators or keystone species. So in the case of predation is where it's eating another organism. So if it's eating that organism is being limited by the level above it because it's being eaten. And then that's going to have an impact on the level below, which has an impact on the level below, and so on. So top-down limiting factors. Keystone species, I'll talk a little bit on the next slide, but All of these factors will be talked about even more in a future set of notes because not only do they put limits on populations, but this is going to limit the entire ecosystem as well because it limits multiple trophic levels since they're all connected together. A keystone species is a species whose impact on its particular ecosystem has a huge importance, even though this particular species um, may not be found as common. They might not have a lot in numbers, like they might not have a huge population size, but their importance within that ecosystem is huge. They essentially prevent other organisms within that community from totally taking over that ecosystem. And so removal of a keystone species or death of a keystone species will drastically change an ecosystem. A good example is like an elephant. An elephant is a keystone species because it eats trees at certain growth points, and when it does that, it manages the trees so that they don't grow incredibly tall or bushy at the top. And if they did that, they'd block the light to the grasses below. And then the grasslands would turn into a dense forest because you'd have these huge trees. And so elephants prevent those trees from monopolizing that ecosystem and completely changing that ecosystem. It maintains the grasslands so that all the other organisms have the grasses to depend on as well. And again, we'll talk more about keystone species in a future set of notes. And that's it for the part 2 notes.